It's House Bill 1481, passed by the Texas legislature, signed into law by Governor Greg Abbott in June, and it prohibits students from using phones, smartwatches, or wireless earbuds during the instructional day. School districts are trying to figure out how to enforce it before everybody goes back in Texas around the middle of August. Chris, what do you think? Are you a fan of the law?
I didn't know phones were allowed at school. Why would phones ever have been allowed in schools in the first place?
Welcome to episode 80 of the Weekly Docket, a podcast by the Silberman Law Firm where we talk legal news and practical law. Today is July 24th, 2025. I'm Phil Silberman, owner of the firm and your host, and I'm joined by Chris Heald, the firm's supervising attorney and my co-host. Chris, are your kids ready to go back to school?
No.
See, at this point in the summer, though, it gets real late in the summer. A lot of kids they do start wanting to go back to school, just not yours.
I don't think they want to go back. I think they like what they're doing.
Okay. We started seeing back to school commercials like in June, so it's finally come. But let's go ahead and talk about what is on our docket today. And we are going to discuss a Texas law that's banning phones in the classrooms for all the kids going back to school. So big change, no more phones in the classrooms. And then we're going to talk about answer a legal question about trust. Chris and I had a little polite conversation intro about whether trusts provide asset protection or not. And then finally, in our Rant and Rave section, we're going to be talking about housing, how it's not affordable. There's a shortage of it, but yet there's a lot of selling or sellers attempting to sell in the Sunbelt. So why the paradox? And a little spoiler, we're going to be talking about a new bill that's going to try to help a little bit. All right, let's get it started with our legal news section. And the first thing we are discussing is Texas law. It's House Bill 1481, passed by the Texas legislature, signed into law by Governor Greg Abbott in June, and it prohibits students from using phones, smartwatches, or wireless earbuds during the instructional day. School districts are trying to figure out how to enforce it before everybody goes back in Texas around the middle of August. Chris, what do you think? Are you a fan of the law?
I didn't know phones were allowed at school. Why would phones ever have been allowed in schools in the first place?
That sounds like you are a fan. So no phone. We're going to start calling.
I guess I'm not getting it. In what circumstance would a child have a phone in school? I could see needing it to call your parents after school, but it seems like a pretty easy rule. Phones stay in backpacks all day. You don't bring phones out.
Yeah, so they do bring the phones to school. They're allowed to do that. Apparently, up until this law change, they were able to have the phones in class, I guess, at some schools. It seems ridiculous to me. Anytime I don't go to court as much as I'd like the opportunity, Chris, at this point, but when I used to go to court or when I have been to court, I would always be terrified that my cell phone was going to go off in court. Am I the only one as an attorney? Am I the only attorney who has that fear? Have you ever had that happen, or have you ever seen that happen to an attorney in front of the judge?
It happens all the time. People are not as scared as they should be. People don't respect courtroom decorum. I haven't ever owned a phone that I've ever turned the ringer on. I don't know how people operate in that world with ringers on. That's weird to me. But people do it all the time, and judges get mad, and people just say, "I'm sorry." But I don't understand.
I hope none of our lawyers
phones in school. Why would you ever allow a phone in school? What would they ever need a phone for?
And I'm not saying I just like to give both sides. They're talking a lot about they're allowed to use them for emergencies. There's an exception. I think this would be a pretty rare exception for health-related situation. Students who required a device for medical monitoring will obviously not have their phone taken from them. Here's what the critics say. Quote, they'll ban phones, but won't do a thing about protecting kids from school shootings. And then here's another quote.
I think they've banned guns in school too. Fear not, guns are banned too.
Quote, can we take a moment to think about 10-year-old Uvalde Robb, elementary fourth grader, so-and-so student who made multiple calls to 911 during the shooting. And then there's this one, a parent says, I pay for my son's phone, period. If grades are on point, no behavior issues, and doing what needs to be done while he's at school, he will be taking his phone to school. Simple. So, Chris, are having phones at school for emergency purposes and not allowing kids to use them in class mutually exclusive?
No, I guess, again, that's what I'm still not getting, but this is what I get for not knowing anything. Yes, they can bring them, but they would stay in your backpack all day. So yes, if there's an emergency of any kind, then yes, please pull your phone out and use it as needed. But my guess is this is not aimed at that. This is that children are actually using their phones during the day, which could not possibly have any use.
Yeah, I agree. It's a straw man question. They're clearly not mutually exclusive. And I think the left is using this gun issue, which school shootings are terrible. Okay. It's a tragedy.
Yes.
But they're not, I don't see a correlation between banning phones in school and school shootings. I just don't see how the two things are related. One of the things I thought about, Chris, you remember growing up, I assume it's the same. You're not allowed to wear a hat like a ball cap or a baseball cap in school. And schools have been banning hats for years, and parents pay for their baseball hats. And that doesn't give that doesn't mean the school can't ban hats at school. So I think the same logic applies to phones. I think it's a good law. Chris thinks it's a good law. Chris, I'm glad it's something we agree on.
I'm surprised it ever existed, but yes, I agree. We weren't allowed to wear hats. I guess to your point, if you use whatever,
let's move on to our legal question.
All right,
let's move on to our legal question section now, because I think that news piece was an easy one. We think it's the elephant in the room, but all right, moving on to our legal question section. Now, Chris, you had just chatted me up. Oftentimes, you like to bait me into an argument, and Chris will say something inflammatory in a chat message, and this time he said something like, trusts provide asset protection. And my response was, some of them do. And Chris, you said I disagree, but let's go ahead and talk about it. In fair disclosure, Chris knows way more about trust than I do. But let me at least recite the conventional wisdom about trust. This is Law School 101. Generally speaking, if beneficiaries can get to the assets, to the corpus of the trust, then so can the creditors. So irrevocable trusts, they provide asset protection. Revocable, which is the most popular of which is the revocable living trust, those do not. So, Chris, let's talk about rev trusts a little bit, just briefly. We've covered them before in the show. Usually the way these are set up is Chris, correct me if I'm wrong, the trustor, that's the person who creates the trust, and the beneficiaries and the trustee are usually the same person. Is that generally correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. So in that case, obviously the beneficiary controls all the assets. Those are not going to provide any asset protection. Chris, do you agree with my recitation of the general kind of Law School 101 about trust?
Yeah, that's a very good simplification. Yes.
Okay. Do you have anything you wanted to add to that, or any point you were trying to make or about trust the other day, or?
Yeah, it's just I don't know how technical you want me to get. Trusts, first and foremost, are not legal entities, right? A trust is a relationship. We feel like a trust is a box that we put things in. It's not really. We're creating a legal relationship through the legal documents we draft. And so it's not, I don't want clients to ever have in their head that I am taking this asset of mine and I'm putting it somewhere else, and therefore it's not mine anymore. That's just not true. It's still yours. Your legal relationship with that asset has just changed, and maybe not all that much. In an irrevocable trust where, okay, now I've put this asset in this trust and I can't even get to it anymore. Good job. You've now protected it from creditors. But remember, you can't get to it anymore. So what good have you done in protecting this asset, as it is now no longer yours? If you've preserved it for family, that's one thing, but you no longer have it now. So to the extent you were worried about losing that asset, you just gave it up.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't exactly understand why. I think trusts are really overused today. You see a lot of people call us, can you do a land trust for me? That's just a trust that holds land. I don't see the need to do them. I think we all have moved on to LLCs at this point. You can make some arguments for trust. You'll hear that the anonymity is a little bit easier, but the more popular asset protection vehicle is definitely the LLC, the Series LLC. Those are topics for another show. And as Chris pointed out, trusts are not a legal entity. The LLCs arise out of contract. You don't even need an operating agreement, although it's good to have one. And I think LLCs are just a little bit easier for banks and title companies to deal with now because they've become so popular.
But they still don't do exactly what people think. If I own an LLC and it's a sole member LLC, it's still my asset.
It's still your asset. And that, again, I don't want to take that rabbit trail or that tangent too far, because then we start talking about charging orders against LLCs and how that differs from corporations. But let's go ahead and keep that for another day. Some of the problems and challenges that LLCs have as an asset protection vehicle. But I still think it's the best thing out there. And you'll see some complex asset protection structures where you're combining trusts and LLCs. And I don't think the multiple layers do a lot, really.
Yeah, I think as you pointed out, I think you're not necessarily hiding or protecting everything. There's no reason to make it any easier on your creditors than you need to. So if you have a trust and it has a trustee whose name you may not recognize because it's not in your personal name, and you call the trust something that someone's not going to look for, and you have a different name on your LLC, then you get into, okay, we're just not going to make it easy on you. We're not going to hide anything or commit perjury if we're required to do disclosures or anything like that. But we also don't have to willingly serve it up to you on a silver platter.
Yeah. And that's probably a good topic for another show. We can take a deep dive on those. So we'll do that at a later time, because that is a very popular topic, is asset protection. All right. That brings us to our rant and rave section, my favorite section of the show, because I get to talk a little bit about stuff that's not exactly completely legally based. And this one's, I'm passionate about housing. I own a property management company as well. And I was running some reports. And Chris, we are struggling. The management company is struggling to lease properties all around the state of Texas. And we just can't get tenants in the properties, and the rents are just too high. And it's the same thing on the sales side. You hear about this shortage of housing and all these the Sunbelt states, Florida, Texas, Arizona, states like that, really, I think, squarely in a housing correction at this point. Now, that correction is from some very high highs. Here's a little data. Austin and North Dallas, they're seeing some big price corrections. In DFW, the Dallas-Fort Worth area, we now have 5.4 months of supply. That's a 20% increase year over year. And to take you back to the post-pandemic craze, Chris, we only had 1 month of supply in North Dallas in 2021. We now have 5.4 months of supply. That means it would take over 5 months for all the buyers to buy all the houses currently on the market. And in Austin, listings jumped 70% year to date. And the most shocking stat to me overall is that almost half of all listings in these markets are being pulled down. The sellers are trying to sell them, and the sellers are not getting the prices they're wanting, and then they're pulling them down. In fact, they're calling my property management company saying, hey, now let me try to lease them. But I actually cut the advertising way back on the management company. It doesn't do me any good to manage a bunch of properties I can't lease, Chris, because I only get paid if I lease and manage. That's just to paint a picture of the housing market. It's a bad deal out there right now.
Wasn't the problem 2 years ago there was no inventory?
Yes, exactly. That was the 2021 stat, or the 22. There was no inventory. And now we've come full circle. The realtors will tell you it's very local. There are some better markets than other. Most of the softness we're seeing is like in the suburban market, where there's a lot of new homes competing against resales. Those are the big problems. New home builders have been flooding the market with new homes, and that's creating a lot of problems.
What does that mean?
Resale,
explain for our listeners, not for me, because obviously I know, but pretend I do. I don't know. What do you mean when you say a soft market? What exactly does that mean when you real estate people say a soft market?
Yeah, it means it's bad for sellers, right? So you got prices going down, taking a long time.
Aren't there some markets that are bad for sellers because there's no inventory and so nobody wants them? And now, like I said, we have the exact opposite, where there's too much inventory and so prices are being driven down.
The problem is the housing is still unaffordable. And the sellers are not continuing to lower just like my landlords on the property on their leases. If I were that landlord, I'm going to drop like $100 every couple of weeks, or maybe $100 a week. I don't. At some point, maybe I am cash flow negative on that property, but at least I'm stopping the bleeding to the point where at least I'm not going to take anybody that's going to tear up my property. Now, the problem is if you're a seller, there's a couple problems. If you're a seller and you bought your property at the peak of the market and you're in North DFW or you're in Austin, you can only lower it so much before you're now upside down. You're as the sales price would make you upside down, and you have to ask the bank for a short sale. And until that seller is put in financial hardship where they have to where they lose a job and they have no choice, the sellers are probably going to hang on to those properties. But if we get an economic shock to the labor market, then you're going to see huge amounts of foreclosures. And there's a bunch of buyers out there that have been on the sidelines, but they can't afford the houses even at these prices because the houses have gone up 50% and then we've only corrected 20%. So or 10 or 15%. So you're still unaffordable in Austin relative to what buyers can qualify for. And here,
people all bought in the last 5 years.
The buying at the height of the market did not help. But if you were a seller and you bought before the price explosion, sometimes it's just a little bit of greed. Like you saw what your neighbor got last year, and you're like, I'm not gonna sell for less than my neighbor got, so I'll hang on thinking it's gonna get better.
That's what I think it is. They missed the boat, and that happens. It's the same as holding a stock. If the stock goes up and then it comes back down, you hold on to it and say, I'm going to wait for it to go back up to what it was. There's no guarantee it goes back up. And so these sellers are sitting there saying, oh, I could have sold and I thought about selling, and a realtor contacted me and said, hey, are you interested in selling? And I said, no. And now I'm regretting that choice. We got to live in the here and now. We can't live in yesterday.
Yeah, I'm with you, but there's the psychology of it is not there. There has to be some economic shock to get those sellers to come down. Here's my rant on it. The Trump administration, realtors, mortgage bankers, they're constantly calling for lower interest rates. That might help a little bit, but that's not going to cure the affordability problem because your prices went up so high. And then the other thing is it punishes savers. So if you've got some savings and you can put money in treasuries or high yield corporate bonds, you shoot interest rates down. Now you're forcing people that are savers to go into riskier assets like the stock market, which is already super frothy and overpriced in my opinion. But politicians are now grasping at straws to trying to make a dent. And here's one thing that came up. This is called the Supply Act. This is a bipartisan bill that was proposed in the House last week by Sam Liccardo, Democrat out of California, and Andrew Garbarino, Republican out of New York. And do you know what an ADU is, Chris? Accessory dwelling unit. You ever heard of that? They're not that big in Texas, but they're big on the East Coast. They're big in places where you have really expensive real estate. It's you know what a she shed is? You ever heard of a she shed? Or or a granny flat, okay? Or just like it's just a structure that can be lived in or used on the property. And most neighborhoods actually have restrictions against that. Some states, like the state of Massachusetts, they've passed a statewide law that says you have to allow an ADU now where municipalities cannot trump them, because the idea is the state government understands there's a shortage of housing. And they're saying you can now, Chris, in Texas, it'd be a trailer. Okay. It'd be like if you wanted to put a double wide in your backyard, Chris. All right, that would be an ADU, an accessory dwelling unit. And a lot of it is manufactured housing. So
we probably don't need
it's okay. So, and that's the whole not in my backyard thing. Nobody wants double wides in the back of their neighbor's yard in their nice neighborhood. But people are starting to come around because there's such a shortage of affordable housing. And they're like, let's not call it a double wide. Let's call it manufactured housing. You can get some decent manufactured housing, Chris, to put in your backyard. So, when the kids are 25 or 30 and they get married and they can't afford a place in Memorial or Houston or wherever, Chris, you can have them come and live there with an ADU. And this Supply Act, what it does, it's virtually impossible to get a second mortgage to build an ADU. Okay. But what the Supply Act does is it says if this thing gets passed, it will set up a structure for enabling financing, okay, for constructing ADUs. And that's going to help get more of these things built. Chris, so our children will be able to live in our backyards because they can't afford any houses because houses are so expensive. That's how this works. So,
That sounds like a horrible idea.
all right.
My kids are going to find somewhere else to live when they turn 18. I'll tell you that.
I agree. All right, that brings our show to a close. I've been your host, Phil Silverman. Chris has been my co-host. Like us, follow us, review us wherever you get your podcast. And as a reminder, nothing in the show is to be considered legal advice, and this has all been for entertainment purposes only. If you have a legal question, email us at info@soblawfirm.com. Tell us you want it publicly answered in the podcast. Everybody have a great rest of your week and weekend.